How does replacement theology interpret Matthew 8, verses 11 to 12? Replacement theology, also known as supersessionism, is a Christian theological perspective that posits that the church has replaced Israel in God's plan. This viewpoint interprets certain biblical passages as indicating that the promises made to Israel are now fulfilled in the Christian church. Matthew 8, verses 11 to 12 states, "I tell you, many will come from the east and the west, and will take their places at the feast, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside, into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." In the context of replacement theology, this passage is interpreted to mean that the true heirs of God's promise are no longer exclusively the Jewish people, but include Gentiles, non-Jews, who accept Christ. The mention of the feast with the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob symbolizes inclusion in the kingdom of heaven based on faith rather than ethnic lineage. Moreover, the subjects of the kingdom who are cast out can be seen as the Jewish leaders or those who rejected Jesus, indicating that rejection of Christ leads to exclusion from God's promise. This interpretation reinforces the idea that, through the gospel of Jesus, a new covenant has been established, and the church now embodies the fulfillment of God's kingdom on earth. Overall, within replacement theology, Matthew 8, verses 11 to 12 is seen as a pivotal scripture that supports the belief that the church has taken over the role previously held by Israel, with salvation now available to all who believe, irrespective of their ethnic background.
How does Christian Zionism address the interpretation mentioned above in relation to replacement theology? Christian Zionism offers a contrasting interpretation to replacement theology when addressing Matthew 8, verses 11 to 12. Rather than viewing the church as having replaced Israel in God's plan, Christian Zionists uphold the belief that God's covenant with Israel remains intact and that the Jewish people still play a central role in biblical prophecy and redemption history. Christian Zionist interpretation of Matthew 8, verses 11 to 12. 1. Gentile inclusion, not replacement. Christian Zionists agree that this passage affirms the inclusion of Gentiles. Many will come from the east and the west in the kingdom of heaven. However, they reject the idea that this means Israel has been replaced. Instead, they see this as an expansion of God's promises rather than a transfer of them. The feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob represents the fulfillment of God's covenant, but not at the exclusion of Israel. 2. Rebuke of unbelief, not national rejection. When Jesus speaks of the subjects of the kingdom being cast out, Christian Zionists interpret this as referring to individuals who reject Christ, rather than a national rejection of Israel as a whole. The passage is seen as a warning to those who assume their ethnic heritage alone guarantees salvation, but does not imply that all Jews are rejected. Instead, individual faith in Jesus determines inclusion in the kingdom. 3. Ongoing role of Israel in God's plan. Christian Zionism maintains that Israel remains God's chosen people and that biblical prophecies regarding Israel's restoration, particularly those concerning the land and end times, are still in effect. They often cite passages such as Romans 11, verses 25 to 29, which speaks of a future restoration of Israel as evidence that God has not permanently cast away the Jewish people. 4. Dual covenant theology, or partial hardening. While some Christian Zionists hold to a form of dual covenant theology, the idea that Jews are saved under a separate covenant without needing to accept Jesus explicitly, most adhere to the belief that Israel is temporarily hardened, Romans 11, verse 25, until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. This means that Jewish unbelief is not permanent, and many Jews will turn to Christ in the future, particularly in an eschatological context. Response to replacement theology. Christian Zionists reject the idea that Matthew 8, verses 11 to 12, supports replacement theology because the passage affirms Gentile inclusion, but not Israel's exclusion. The rejection mentioned is of individuals who lack faith, not the entire Jewish nation. The broader biblical narrative, particularly in Romans 9-11, confirms that God has not abandoned Israel. Instead, Christian Zionism sees God's promises as irrevocable and believes that both Jews and Gentiles have a place in God's redemptive plan, with Israel maintaining a distinct and ongoing role in biblical prophecy.